Thanks very much for joining us today for this webinar hosted jointly by the Department of Foreign Affairs and the European Commission's representation in Ireland. So this webinar forms part of a series of events organised by the European Commission to discuss EU career opportunities for translators and interpreters. I'm joined online by our guest speakers, Caoimhe Alliot and Kevin McCarthy. Caoimhe and Kevin will explain and expand in relation to careers in translation and interpretation in the EU institutions. And they're part of the community of Irish people working in the EU institutions and agencies. The government greatly values the role that this community has played and continues to play in shaping the EU and its institutions. And that's, of course, because a strong understanding and connection with the EU's institutions and agencies is really critical to ensuring that Ireland can effectively engage with the EU. In 2021, the government launched its strategy, A Career for EU, aimed at increasing Ireland's staffing representation in the EU institutions and agencies. The strategy includes a number of measures to support Irish candidates, and webinars such as this are an important part of these efforts. The Department of Foreign Affairs also provides support to Irish citizens applying for jobs in the EU at every step of the process, including online practice packs and one-to-one training depending on the competition stage. Our EU Jobs website has practical advice for people interested in a career with the EU institutions, and I'd encourage as many of you as possible to visit that site. Please do contact us if you are applying for EU posts, and you can do that at eujobs@dfa.ie. Apart from the broader language roles that we will discuss today, I'd also like to take a moment to highlight the strong demand for Irish language speakers in the EU institutions and agencies. Irish became a full official and working language of the EU at the start of this year, meaning that it is now officially on an equal footing with the EU's other 23 official languages. The Department of Tourism, Culture, Arts, Gaeltacht, Sport and Media engages extensively in supporting candidates for Irish language roles. Since 2018, they have run an Irish language internship scheme in EU institutions, and more than 20 graduates have already taken part in that scheme. The scheme is focused on the provision of opportunities for graduates to acquire work placements in the field of translation and proofreading. Each year, 10 graduates are appointed and undertake work experience in the autumn. An allowance of €2,000 per month is made available for the internships for a period of 10 months. The internship scheme helps build Irish people's experience of professional translation and proofreading, and a number of interns have gone on to take up positions as linguists in the EU. Applications for that particular scheme are expected to open later in the spring. The government also supports the work of the Centre for Excellence for EU Careers in the Irish Language, which is based at NUI Galway. The Centre is engaged in crucial work in support of the goal of increasing Irish representation within the European institutions, including through the translation of the ultimate EU textbook into Irish. So more information on career opportunities with Irish can be found via the Commission Representations website. But now I'd like to turn to our guest speakers today. Caoimhe Alliot works as a translator in the European Commission, and Kevin McCarthy is an interpreter working for the English Interpretation Unit at DG Interpretation, the European Commission's interpreting service. I'll shortly hand the floor to both Caoimhe and Kevin to expand on their own experience and background. And after their presentations, I'm going to open the floor to questions from our audience today. You can use your questions, you can ask your questions through the Slido platform by going to the web page Slido, sli.do, and using the code #translator to access the system. So that's go to the web page Slido, sli.do, and use the code #translator in order to ask your questions. You don't have to register, anyone can do it. It's a very simple process. So look, let's get started. You've heard enough from me, and I think it's time to hear from our first speaker. So Caoimhe, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Eamonn. Hi, everyone. So my name is Caoimhe Alliot. I'm Irish, as you can tell by the accent. I'm from Galway originally, and I've been in Luxembourg now for the past 16 years, working as a translator since I got here in 2006. And I have been working for the European Commission for the past 7 years, more or less. I'm going to switch to a slideshow now, simply because there's not enough time to go through everything that I want to share with you today, and this will at least help me keep on track a little bit. If I can find it. I'm going to talk to you today basically about what it's like to work at the European Commission as a translator and what's involved in getting a job as a European translator. Just having a bit of trouble sharing, which didn't happen in practice run, obviously. Just give me one more second. This is strange. This didn't happen a little while ago. Gosh, what's going on?
I think we're seeing something on the screen now. Not your full slide yet, but I think you may be getting close.
Okay, I'm getting a lot of strange error messages this time that I wasn't getting before. You can't see that?
Not seeing anything, I think, at the moment. Caoimhe, one suggestion I have is, and not to sort of completely frighten Kevin, but maybe we could give you a moment to try and sort that out, and have Kevin, if he feels he could come in at this stage, kick us off, or do you want to maybe try to present without the slides? I'll give you a quick second to think about that, Caoimhe, to let us know how best to proceed.
Okay.
Just another suggestion there. I don't know if Eamonn actually has the presentation. She might be able to help out with that as well. I can see things are coming up on the screen. I can.
Yeah, you're sharing your screen, Caoimhe. It's just not open on the.
Can you see this now?
Just not your presentation. You have Webex as you're showing us Webex.
Yeah, it's not giving me any. It's very strange. It was giving me far more options earlier. Hold on.
Caoimhe, could you go through the first part of your presentation there, and I can try and make sure that we get the presentation through to Aidan so that he can share it. Is that all right? Could you start out without it, because everybody's going to have it afterwards anyway?
Yeah.
And I'll send it through so that Aidan can maybe open it for you. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so basically, just to give you a little bit of background about my own path. I studied applied languages at UL with French and Spanish as my languages. And while I was there, I spent as much time as I could abroad in France and in Spain, waitressing, working in call centers, that kind of thing. I spent 9 months at Alcatel in Paris as part of my work placement. So I really tried to do as much as I could during my time at UL studying languages to get my languages up to a very high level. Straight away after that, I went on to do a master's in translation studies. I went to DCU. That was because I had basically decided that I really did want a career in languages. So I decided to go ahead and at least try and see where it took me, even though I was hearing a lot of, negative feedback about, it might be difficult to get a job in languages, and you can't work in languages, there's no jobs. But as I really was interested in languages, I decided just to go ahead with it. I did the master's and moved to Luxembourg a week after handing in my dissertation, where I started my first job as an in-house financial translator. That was a very, very tough start, going from a kind of an academic situation, translating as part of my master's degree, to having to deal with very tight deadlines, very demanding clients. But it was very, very good training, very, very good experience. And after about 8 years, at that stage, I'd gone from junior translator to senior translator to head of the translation department. I decided to try a competition and see how I would get on. I was living in Luxembourg anyway, so it was, you know, kind of a no-brainer really. So I tried a competition. It took quite a long time. It was a one-year endeavor, bit over 1 year. There's a lot of hoops to jump through. It was a lot of work. I practiced and prepared for the competition as many hours a day as I could. And luckily I got through the competition, and I was contacted by the European Commission for an interview, and I was offered the job. And so I started there in 2015 with French and Spanish as my languages, and I've since added German and Romanian as working languages. For those of you who don't know much about the European Commission, it's basically the EU civil service. It proposes new legislation to the European Parliament and the Council. It enforces EU law together with the Court of Justice. It represents the EU internationally, and it manages the EU budget. So this multiple role, as you can imagine, is very much reflected in the work of all of the translators. At the moment, as you can imagine, there's a huge workload related to the crisis in Ukraine. And before it was COVID, before that it was Brexit. So there's always a lot of work, a lot of very varied work going on. We translate at DGT. So DGT is the European Commission's translation service, translation department. It's the Directorate General for Translation. And we translate from and into all 24 EU official languages, plus a few extra ones, for example, Arabic, Turkish, Chinese. We cover almost all subject areas. So, for example, agriculture, finance, economy, industry, health, environment, transport, border controls, everything related to that. So again, our work as translators is extremely varied. Most of the translation teams at DGT, so at the European Commission's Translation Department, translate from English, and they translate documents drafted in-house into their native languages. So most of my colleagues' work is from English into their mother tongue, for example. Whereas what's really interesting about the English language department at the European Commission is that we translate from all of the official languages into English. So we could have a day, one day we're translating from Romanian, the next day from Danish, the next day from French. It changes all the time. And we are translating everything that comes in from the European Commission, everything that comes into the European Commission from the member states. So we can receive it could be letters from citizens, it can be complaints from students, for example, from Romanian students trying to study in Spain and their documents aren't being accepted. We get all sorts of documents from members of the public. We also get a lot of communication from governments, from businesses, NGOs, everything that's coming into us that needs to be dealt with by the Commission, we translate into English so that our colleagues in the policy departments can then look at the document and do what needs to be done. DGT has approximately 2,000 staff working for it, so we are the largest public translation service in the world.
Caoimhe, sorry, Aidan has opened your presentation there. Can you tell him what slide you're on so that he can go straight to that?
Yeah, I think I'm on approximately slide, let me see, 7.
Just he'll be able to open it for you and that should work, okay?
Oh, you're a genius. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
That's wonderful. So as I was saying, we're the largest public translation service in the world. There's approximately 1,400 translators. And as I said before, I worked in a private translation company, and at the time I think there were 13 or 14 of us. So it really is quite amazing to work with 1,400 other professionals working in the same field as you. As you can imagine, we have lots of very nerdy conversations about languages and other linguistic matters. And most of us are based in Luxembourg. Slightly more than half of us are based in Luxembourg. And we also have quite a lot of support staff. So in HR, management, outsourcing, and all of that. You can go to the next slide, maybe. I'll just move on to the next slide. So translation basically makes the EU very democratic, as you can imagine. The work that we do allows the members of the EU countries to understand the laws that apply to them, to play a full part in EU activities, to contribute to the work of the EU institutions in their own language, and to ensure that EU staff can understand correspondence from members of the public. So if you can imagine, if we weren't there behind the scenes translating all of these documents, there would be pretty much a massive breakdown in communication. So it really is very important, the work that we're doing. DG Translation, if you're wondering how much it costs about 349 million per year. All the translation, all the language services combined, so translation and interpreting for all the EU institutions, so the Commission, the Court of Justice, the Court of Auditors, the Parliament, etc., it costs each EU citizen about €2.50 a year, which is about the same as a cup of coffee, or cheaper, I think. So it's really quite a small amount of the EU budget, and it really does mean that people everywhere in Europe can understand everything that's going on. You do sometimes hear people saying, why can't it just stay in English? English is the main language, but it's really not the case if you go, abroad, and it just really wouldn't be at all fair. So now I'm on slide 10. So what is it actually like to work at DGT? So I think one of the nicest things about working at DGT is that you get to work in a very multicultural environment where you're meeting people from all over Europe and beyond every day. You're working with people from everywhere. You get a chance to use your languages. So any languages you have, you get to keep them up, and you also get to learn more languages. As translators, we have a lot of training opportunities, not just for languages. We can get training in really anything that's related to the policy areas that we translate about. But I suppose some of the most exciting and interesting options, training options for translators, are the language classes that we get to do. So we have a choice. We can do weekly classes. We can do intensive classes either in the country that we're based in or abroad. So, for example, since I've started working at the Commission, I did a 2-week intensive stint in Berlin, where I lived with a German person. I went to intensive private classes every day, really immersed myself in the language. And 2 weeks doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're really focused on learning a language and you've already spent a couple of years doing weekly classes at home, then it's just a really excellent way to really just get, kind of perfect your skills as much as possible. And I did the same with Romanian. I did 12 weeks of intensive Romanian classes in Luxembourg with a Romanian teacher in Luxembourg. And then I went immediately to Romania for 2 weeks, where I did 40 hours of private lessons a week. It was really intense and really exhausting. And then private lessons via Skype for 2 years after that. So there's so many options available to us to get our languages up to the level that we need. And there's a lot of support provided to translators. And as you'll see with Kevin, for interpreters, there's even more support, as they need their languages to be less passive than in the case of translators. So we work with a CAT tool. That's how we translate every day. We're sitting in front of the computer. We're using a lot of tools to help us in our work. So we use Studio in our work. And we also have a very big translation memory called Euramis. It's the biggest translation memory in the world that contains only human-produced translations. Our translation memory, Euramis, basically contains everything that human translators at all of the institutions have translated in the past. So it's a very valuable database, as you can imagine. Good old-fashioned dictionaries, of course, are still being used. We do have our own machine translation tool at the Commission. It was developed at the Commission. It's called e-translation, and we're using that more and more because the results are getting better and better. But it's still, not enough really to, it'll never be enough. It'll never replace the human translation skills. And also, as I said before, there are 1,400 of us working at the European Commission. So as you can imagine, having that support and having all those other translators around you every day is really such an important resource. You can contact your colleagues in other departments. The Romanian department, for example, I very often need to contact them just to really get to that, really try and understand something that I'm struggling with, but also our colleagues in the same unit, in the same language unit as you, can be very helpful as well. So that's a big support network that we have. So as regards getting a job within within DGT or any of the other institutions, there are various ways to work for the European Commission. I won't talk too much about trainees because I'm not sure, the traineeships, as I'm not sure how many of you here would be interested in that. That's perfect basically for people who are just out of college or haven't, who are looking to get some practice, get some experience and see if they like translation. It's an excellent opportunity. We also work a lot with freelancers, but they've changed the system. A couple of years ago it changed, and now if you wanted to work for the European institutions as a freelance translator, you would have to work with a company that has won a contract with the institutions. So there's no way to work directly as a freelance, as far as I know at the moment. So I'm going to talk a little bit more today about how to get a job as a permanent member of staff. Because to become a temporary agent, the process is similar, just a little bit easier. And to become a contract agent, the process is very streamlined. But then the perks basically aren't as good, and the job security obviously isn't as good. So basically, to become a permanent member of staff, you must be an EU citizen, you must have a university degree, and you do not need to have any professional experience. So what I would say is that if you do have already some professional experience, that will really help you, but you don't need it. Also, your degree doesn't have to be in languages or translation, it can be in anything. For translators, what we're looking for is people with perfect command of all aspects of their mother tongue. So your main language, the language that you will be translating into. You also need to have thorough knowledge of 2 or more official EU languages, at least one of which must be English, French, or German. So this means if you're applying for a job as an English translator, you need to have English as your language 1, French or German as your language 2, and then German or French as your language 3, or any other official EU language. Knowledge of any other languages is a huge asset, so do make sure you list all of your languages on your application form, but please do make sure that you apply with your strongest languages. And the reason for that is that you will need to pass tests in those languages, so make sure you don't choose your most unusual ones because you think they might be more impressive. Make sure you choose your languages for the competition that are your strongest languages. So for translators, we need people who can understand text in the source language and be able to render them correctly in the target language. We need to research topics and terminology quickly and efficiently in both source and target languages. And we need people who are able to use all the tools that we use. However, you get full training in that on arrival, so that's not so important at the application stage. So you need to pass the competition. That's the main thing at the beginning, but anything else that you have, any other experience you have, or any knowledge, any other languages that you have will be considered a bonus. So for example, we have a lot of people who spent most of their early career working as lawyers, or as we have one former actuary. So anything that you have will be considered a huge bonus, because we can translate text ranging on on so many different topics, and some of them are very complex. So if we have somebody on the team who has some extra knowledge of any of these subject matters, it's a huge help to the whole team. Even if you have non-EU languages, make sure you say so. The recruitment competition for permanent officials is really long. It can really drag out. It says that it should take about 9 months, but it's often longer. The competitions will be announced in various places, so in the official journal of the European Union, but also on, I think probably one of the best places to look is on EPSO. Keep an eye on that, the European Personnel Selection Office website. You will get all the information there about upcoming competitions, current competitions. So do keep an eye on that if you're interested in a career. There should be a competition being announced in the not so distant future, but we're very much in the dark on that for the moment. I don't want to spend too much time going into the detail on all the different competition stages, because there's a lot of information. And it's all available online. So if a competition does come up, everything you need to know will be there. But I just want to quickly say that the first stage is to create an EPSO account. And that can be done at any time. You can do that now and have your account ready to go. The application that you have to fill in online is extremely long. So there's so many different parts to it. If you leave it to when a competition comes up, it might take too much time because it really does need to be, you really do need to give it a lot of effort. So if you're very interested in a career as a translator in any area of the European institutions, you could create your EPSO account now already and have everything ready to go so that you can focus. If a competition comes up, you can focus instead on making sure that you've read the notice of competition properly and that you're applying correctly. The second stage is computer-based testing, which you should be able to do in Dublin, for example, wherever you're based. Then there will be revision and translation tests. If you pass all of those, you get invited to the assessment centre in Brussels. I think it's still all happening online for the moment, but hopefully it should be back in Brussels in the near future. And if you get through the assessment centre stage, you get onto the reserve list. Like I said, I don't want to go into too much detail on all of those different phases, except to say that there is a very good book available. Eamonn already mentioned it, I think. It's called the Ultimate EU Test Book. That gives you a lot of tips and tricks to pass the test. And do remember that a lot of people do apply for these competitions, but you won't be up against, your chances are still very good, especially if you have good language skills and you have experience. But a lot of people apply and not so many people prepare as well as they should for the test. So if you are very well prepared, you have a very good chance of getting through. If you get onto the list, then the next stage is that you get invited for interviews. And then if you get to the interview stage, you're doing very, very well, and you have a very good chance of coming to work for us. There's a lot of pros to working for the European Commission. It's both Brussels and Luxembourg are really wonderful places to live, very international cities right in the heart of Europe. You can travel so easily around Europe, so it's really nice to be located here. The work is very varied and very challenging, and there is a lot of scope to move to other areas of the Commission or the institutions if you decide you don't want to stay in translation. You have colleagues from all over the world, which is always a nice bonus. The salary is very, very generous. The leave entitlement is also very generous. I think I have about 45 days of annual leave this year. And obviously we have very good job security. I mean, I don't know if that's important for everyone, but it is a nice bonus to have. And also the work is very flexible. So just a few little takeaways if there are some of you out there who are interested in working for the institutions. If you have an exotic language, or what we call exotic languages are the more unusual ones that aren't taught as often in schools in Ireland and the UK. So if you have a language like that, make sure you mention it in as many parts of the application form as you can. If you can add one while you're waiting for the competition, why not? For example, even Portuguese is considered an exotic language, as we have a lot of work in it and not so many people with the language. So if you have the Romance languages already, why not try and add, for example, Portuguese or Romanian? If you have German, maybe try and add Danish. It's just, it will help you once you get to the reserve list stage if you have extra and more unusual languages. If you have any specialization or experience in a certain area, make sure you mention it a lot in your application form. If you have translation experience already, make sure you describe it as well, because the most important thing is to get through the competition, but after that, we will look at your application form. So make sure you pack that in and pack that with information that will help you stand out. I've also included in my slides, which I don't know if you've been able to see, some links and information, so that will be passed around at the end of the conference. So thank you very much, and I'm sorry about that malfunction, and I do hope that you have some questions for me afterwards, and I hope there is some interest in a career in translation. I can tell you it's a very nice place to work, and it's a very nice environment to work in.
Thanks, Caoimhe. That was really comprehensive and some really practical insights. And I know from talking to people that, you know, some of the particular kind of heads ups you were giving to people there are important. I mean, even just that piece about, for example, creating your EBSO account well in advance of there actually being a competition that you're involved in.
It's a
is,
very big process. I
yeah,
have to say, if you leave it too late, and
yeah,
it takes a lot of work, you need it to be really perfect and really make, you know, showcase yourself.
yeah.
And I do like
So,
to stress to people as well that your chances, if so many people who apply don't prepare at all or don't even turn up for the first set of tests in the competition. So in the book that you mentioned that's been translated into Irish, they say in that book that you're only actually up against 20% of the participants, you know, so you really don't let yourself be put off by the number of people who apply. Your chances are really good if you're well prepared.
look, we'll be coming back to you, Caoimhe. I'm sure there will be questions later on, but thank you again. And I think let's move then to the kind of interpretation side of things and hand over to Kevin McCarthy. Kevin, the floor is yours now. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Eamonn. I'm going to attempt to share a screen now. Let's hope it goes well. But let me just see PowerPoint share. Let's see. Can everybody see that? Just to check.
Yes, I can see it, Kevin.
Okay, that's brilliant. Okay, excellent. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start from the beginning. Let's see, it's just a bit slow. Anyway, so just to very briefly introduce myself, my name is Kevin McCarthy, also Irish. I'm from Limerick, and just like Caoimhe, I studied at the University of Limerick. I did applied languages just like her. So there's actually quite a few of us who've done that course, knocking around Brussels. I'll give you a little bit of background as I go through the presentation, just explain how I got in. I think we've been doing these talks, and it's always good to have the translators go first, because while there are a lot of similarities with translation and the process of working for us, there are also a lot of differences, and I think it's important to talk about those as well. So I have been working for the European Commission's Interpreting Service, which is DG Interpretation, otherwise known as SCIC. You can see there on my name on the screen that I somehow managed to mess that up when joining. I had a lot of different things open on the screen. My name is actually Kevin McCarthy. I work for a service called SCIC, so it's the Service Commande d'Interprétation des Conférences. That's the old name for our Directorate General. It's changed since DG Interpretation, but we still use SCIC. It's in our email addresses, etc. So hence you'll hear the term, the acronym SCIC quite a bit. So I've been working there for about 11 years on staff. I will talk about the process of how I ended up working there. I work from French, Spanish, Dutch, and Romanian into English. And again, I'll talk about that a little bit as well, about the level of language you're supposed to have, because again, there are similarities and difference with the translators. But first of all, let's just start off talking about who we are. So again, you probably have seen interpreters in various different meetings, and again, at the moment, quite a lot of high-level meetings going on. I think there was an interpreter in the news today interpreting President Zelensky. He broke down in tears with emotion, a Ukrainian interpreter. Just goes to show we're humans as well. We're human beings. We are there. When everything goes well, you tend not to notice us, but sometimes we do tend to end up in the news. So again, at the big meetings, for example, of the European heads of state, you see us in the background. So the picture there of some of our colleagues, and you can see where we work as well. So we work in the booths, in the meeting rooms, and you can see the console we use there again in the meetings. So I work for the European Commission's Interpreting Service, and this is the world's largest interpreting service. So just like DG Translation is the world's largest public translation service, we're the world's largest interpreting service. You've got the United Nations only actually has 6 working languages, whereas we work with 24 languages. And so we need a lot of interpreters to cover all of those languages. And of course, Irish has actually, from the 1st of January, we have to be able to provide Irish as well. So again, how do people communicate in all these languages? Well, as I said, we are the largest interpreting service in the world. That means we have a lot of staff. We have interpreters and support staff. A lot of work goes on behind the scenes. So when it comes to organizing the meeting, there's lots of last minute changes. You have to put together an interpreting team. I'll explain a little bit about that as well. And so we have a whole series of people organizing things behind the scenes to make sure that everything goes smoothly. And then you have the interpreters themselves. So again, slightly outdated, I think this is, but I think it's generally accurate, around 500 staff interpreters. So we wouldn't be able to work without the support staff, but another group of people we wouldn't be able to work without are freelance interpreters, what we call accredited freelance interpreters. I'll talk a lot more about that a little bit later on. I started off as a freelance interpreter, and I think in any given day in the meetings in Brussels, about half of the people working in the booths are staff and half are freelancers. So again, the service just could not function without freelancers. They're an essential part of the service we provide. So who do we work for? We actually have a variety of clients. We have the European Commission, obviously, and the Commission, we are the Commission interpreting service. So we have the meetings, for example, every Wednesday, the Commission meets, so all the commissioners meet. But we also have meetings, for example, dealing with agriculture, all kinds of areas dealt with by the Commission. Every single day at midday in Brussels, you have the European Commission's midday press briefing. So journalists will come and ask questions to the spokespeople. Sometimes announcements are made. Commissioners come out. Various different initiatives are announced there. So we work for that as well. But there's lots of meetings organized by the European Commission. But we also work for the Council of the European Union and the European Council. So the Council of the European Union are the representatives of member states. The 27 member states sit around the table with the Commission and they thrash out legislation. You have Council working parties. So that's experts from various different fields. For example, you'll have a transport working party, you'll have a fisheries working party, you'll have working parties on, for example, justice issues, etc., justice and home affairs, all these kinds of different things, and you'll have representatives from the member states. So I'm sure Eamonn and some of his colleagues will come along and work in those meetings. You have a representative from each member state comes and works in those. So that's another one of the fora we work in, and the European Council are the heads of state and government. So again, when you've got these big meetings, you have the summits in Brussels. Then every 6 months, you have a new presidency. So there's a rotating presidency of the council. At the moment, it's France. And we work in meetings organized by the presidencies. That means we travel a fair bit. I've been to France already for some presidency meetings. I was in Strasbourg for a presidency meeting. The previous presidency was Slovenia, so I went to Ljubljana a fair bit. For that, I was in Ljubljana a few times. We had the pandemic before that, but the previous presidency where I traveled a bit was the Croatian presidency, so I went to Zagreb. And in fact, thanks to these presidencies, I think I've been to almost every single EU member state except Cyprus. I don't think I've been to Nicosia yet, but that's the only EU capital I haven't been to. So we do get to travel quite a bit. And we work for two other institutions, the Economic and Social Committee, which brings together civil society, trade unions, the social partners, etc., and the Committee of the Regions. So they can be quite interesting because there's a lot of variety in these meetings. The Committee of the Regions brings together local representatives, so members of county councils, regional governments, etc. And so they're a consultative body. They provide their opinions to the European institutions. There's the European Investment Bank. There's all kinds of other bodies, offices and agencies of the EU. You have the European Centres for Disease Control, which was in the news a fair bit, and that's in Stockholm. There's the European Institute for Gender Equality, which is in Vilnius. So you've got various different bodies around the EU, and occasionally we go and work for those as well. And it's also worth noting that the European Parliament and the European Court of Justice have their own interpreting services. The Parliament has a fairly large interpreting service, not quite as big as ours, but quite a big and active interpreting service. And the European Court of Justice has their own interpreting service as well, slightly smaller, based in Luxembourg. So just to give you an idea of the meetings, now this is pre-pandemic, it's kind of getting back to normal. There would be around 50 meetings a day in Brussels, most of them requiring interpretation. You sometimes have small meetings where you just have two languages, so English and French mostly, or you'll have bilateral meetings. You'd have a delegation, for example, come from Spain, and that'll be English and Spanish. And that just requires 4 interpreters. Now, why 4 instead of 2? So you need 2 interpreters per language in the small meetings because interpreting is quite a sort of mentally strenuous activity, so it requires a lot of concentration. We can't really work longer than 30-minute shifts, and you have to be relieved by your colleague afterwards. That's why you need more than 2 interpreters per language. And when it comes to bigger meetings, however, and here you can see a picture, this is one of the big meeting rooms. This used to be where they would host the summit meetings. Now they have a new building for that. And this is one of the big meeting rooms where you can provide all of the languages. So you're able to have, there's more than 24 interpreting booths there. So you can have what we call full language regime. So everybody in that meeting can speak and listen to their own language, which is quite a major logistical feat. And for that, so for a meeting with 23 languages, now 24 with Irish, so for 23 languages, you need 69 interpreters. If you were to add Irish in, you would bring that up to 72. And so there'll be 3 interpreters per language. Usually what happens is that you will have 3 interpreters that try to cover as many languages as possible. So I would have my languages, which are French, Dutch, Spanish, and Romanian. I'd have a colleague who'd do German, Italian, etc. So they would try to cover as many languages as possible. And then we have a system called Relay. And I have a video on that. It's a bit technically complicated to show it to you, but I've actually given you a link at the end of this. And when this is sent around to you, you can click on that link, and it just demonstrates how Relay works. So essentially, for example, if somebody in the room speaks Greek, how does the Lithuanian, for example, understand Greek? Well, what happens is we've got a relay system. So, for example, the Greek speaks, and then let's say somebody in the English booth or the French booth will interpret that into their languages, and the Lithuanian colleague will switch on to the English or French channel and work into Lithuanian. So it's a fairly complicated system, and there's all kinds of different considerations. You can't have more than one link in that chain, because otherwise things start to fall apart. And you have to have 2 people as well for a language. So let's say one person goes out to the toilet and, Greece speaks. You have to have more than one person covering that, and it's all a very complicated system. And that's why the support staff is essential, because let's say in the morning one guy with Greek falls ill, can't make it, and they have to rearrange everything essentially to try and cover everything. And so sometimes as an interpreter, you have to constantly check your program. Sometimes you're given a call in the morning saying you're not going to that meeting, you've got to go to another meeting, so you have to be very adaptable. This is just an overview of my weekly program. Just to give you an idea of the variety, I won't go into too much detail on this, but for example, on the Monday, I had some admin work to do. On the Tuesday and Wednesday, it was a meeting by the Commission. It was an anti-competitive practice meeting. So you had somebody brought in, they were rigging the market in one particular field, which I'm not allowed to tell you. And you had their lawyers defending them. So you had a Belgian lawyer speaking French defending them. I think it was a Spanish company. And you also had the Commission there as well. And so there were 3 languages there, so French, English, and Spanish. And then on the Thursday, it was a meeting of the council. So it was a much larger language regime. So I was working with 2 colleagues in the booth. So there were 3 of us. You can see to the right there the list of languages. At the top is what we call, so those are the languages you can speak, and the bottom languages are the languages you can listen to. So there are some cases, for example, with Romanian in that meeting, the Romanian delegate could speak Romanian, but they don't have a Romanian booth to listen to. And again, it's part of all of the complicated arrangements for meetings. And then we have some new Irish interpreters who started, and there were some training courses for them. So I was involved in that. And then on the Friday, I had a press briefing, and the press briefing is quite hairy because, again, people are asking questions. You need to keep up with the news. You need to know what's going on. It can really take you by surprise as well. So people will ask questions about all kinds of things to the Commission's press service. And so it's quite a lot going on there. So you have to really be on the ball as well. You have to kind of follow what's going on in the news. You have to be very adaptable as well. So how do you become an interpreter? Again, as I said, there are similarities and differences with how to become a translator. So first of all, let me dispel some misconceptions that you need to be bilingual or you need to have a background whereby your family were globe-trotting diplomats. That's not the case. But what are the language requirements? What kind of level of language do you need? Well, first of all, unfortunately, I'm going to have to give you some jargon. We interpreters love our jargon, unfortunately. If some people sit at a table next to interpreters and interpreters are talking about interpreting, sometimes I think it can probably be a bit difficult for them to follow. The worst thing is when we all get together and there's all the spouses of interpreters sitting there kind of looking completely vacant, thinking, oh God, you know, they're talking about interpreting again. So unfortunately, it can be a specialized domain. And there's a lot of jargon. So first of all, there's the A language. The A language is your mother tongue. So that's the language into which you work from all your working languages. And that's very important. It's very important to have high level in your A language. You need to be quite eloquent with your A language. In my case, my A language is English, and I work into English from all of my other languages. Now, there is a B language, and that's something we do use occasionally. That's known as a retour. We have a lot of French terminology. It's a language that's not your mother tongue, but in which you are perfectly fluent. Now, the word fluent is something that we usually tend to avoid. Again, I think Caoimhe as well, you'll have noticed she won't have used the word fluent. Fluent is a much abused word. But in this case, it's something that you have to have a very, very, very high level in. And none of the languages I have, and there are some languages, some of my languages I'm more confident speaking than others. None of my languages, I think, are a retour language. It requires a lot of work, and I really don't have the level there. And you have to be really, really quick with it. You have to be able to be very comfortable speaking it. You have to be able to use all of the registers in the language. There's people who, you know, I can speak French perfectly well, but I really wouldn't want to have to interpret into French just because of all the registers and all of the various different nuances in French. I can understand them, but to actually have to come up with them on the spot is not something I can really do. So I don't have a B language. But in some languages, for example, people have, a lot of people have Bs for the smaller languages. For example, the Baltic languages. There are not a lot of people who are native speakers of English who can do those Baltic languages, Latvian, Lithuanian, Estonian. And so those interpreters will tend to work into one of the bigger languages, mostly English, but also French and German. So they do what they call as a retour. But what the most important language is, for us anyway, would be your C languages. So this is a language you can understand perfectly, but into which you do not work. So this is what is the case with most interpreters. And for example, in my case, when it comes to speaking the languages, I would say Romanian is probably my best. I spent a lot of time in Romania. I have a lot of contact with Romania. And then it would be French, and then Spanish and Dutch, not so much. My spoken Dutch is far from beautiful, it has to be said. I was recently on the phone to IKEA customer service in Dutch. I did have to apologize to the lady. She said, well, I can understand what you're going on about. Don't worry about it, you know. But beyond that, it was, I'd hardly win a prize for the most beautiful Dutch spoken. So again, I understand Dutch perfectly well, but when it comes to speaking it, it's a bit rusty, a bit clunky. I don't express myself wonderfully in Dutch, but you have to be able to understand it. And just to have an idea of what level you need, it's, for example, you need to be able to understand beyond what you see on the news. In fact, the nightly news is slightly superficial. You need to be able to read a sort of highbrow newspaper. You need to be able to read a non-fiction book in those languages. Now, obviously, you won't be able to understand every word. I mean, sometimes I have to look up words in English, but you need to be able to have a very, very high level in that language. So the skills of an interpreter. So there's one of our colleagues, John Reed, an excellent interpreter, one of the best, who recently retired. But an interpreter is a cultural interface. So you really need to have an idea of the culture. When you're interpreting a French person, you need to have an idea of where they're coming from. So you need to have a bit of an idea of the background. You need to be able to get certain cultural references, certain historical references. And that's why general knowledge is very important as well. And again, I spoke about the press conference earlier. When you're in the press conference, you need to know what's going on. You need to have an idea of the country's politics, for example, sensitive points that they're likely to raise. Yeah, so that's very, very important. The other thing is we are human beings. We're not robots. Again, you saw that today if you're watching the news, that Ukrainian colleague of ours who was overcome with emotion. We're not robots. Another extreme would be if somebody came and read something out at high speed. That's not something we can do. We're able to deal with things expressed in a human fashion, for example. So if you speak naturally and normally, we can do that. If you read Slowly, yes, but it's not natural speech. It's not natural speech, and it's very difficult for us when you read out. Sometimes we get the text beforehand and we can manage. Sometimes we have to edit a bit while working. And that brings me to another thing. You're translating concepts and ideas and messages. So you're not translating words. Sometimes people say to me, what if you don't know a word? Well, the thing is, you will understand the concept or the message. It's very rare that a word will impede your understanding of something. You can usually guess it from context. You will usually understand it from context. Now, sometimes a word is very important when it comes to terminology. I've done meetings, for example, on fisheries, and they talk about different species of fish. That's very important. We're able to prepare that beforehand. But unlike translators who can look up a word in a dictionary, we don't have that luxury. You have to be able to adapt. You have to, again, have a very high level of the language so that even if there's a word that's thrown out there that you don't know the word, you're able to understand it from the concept, from the context. And again, that you will understand the message. And it's always the case that we don't understand. Whereas we always make mistakes as well. We do make mistakes. Not very often, hopefully, but we do make mistakes. But for the most part, if you have a high level of language, a high understanding of the language, when a word comes, it won't necessarily throw you because you'll understand the idea around it. And when it comes to terminology, again, we have plenty of resources, a lot of them developed by DGT. In fact, we use some of their IT for terminology, their IT tools for terminology. So that's very useful. So we can prepare things beforehand. If I'm doing a meeting on fisheries, I know it's, for example, they're discussing fisheries in the Mediterranean. I can look up what species of fish they're going to talk about. So I know, I look up the various different fishing gear. We have the agenda of the meeting. We have all the documents for the meeting. So I run through those to see what people are going to talk about. And sometimes somebody will raise something that's not been, I say, what about this fish that we discussed 3 meetings ago, etc. You have to be adaptable. I have my iPad with me. I can look it up. My colleagues, that's where your colleagues come in. They help you. They look it up. They write it down for you. So it's teamwork as well, interpreting. So how can you work for the English unit in DG SCIC? Now, this is for the English unit. When it comes to other units, there's slightly different requirements sometimes. What I'm going to tell you here is how to work for the English unit at DG SCIC. So firstly, unlike translators, you do need a very specific qualification, a university qualification in conference interpreting. And I really stress conference interpreting here. There are courses, for example, in public service interpreting. Unfortunately, that won't get you in the door here. It has to be conference interpreting. So you do need a master's in that. Now, the good news is, okay, it's usually a year or sometimes a 2-year course. They're very practical courses. They're not very academic. You don't have to write dissertations, etc., and all that. At least when I did my master's course, I didn't have to spend a lot of time writing a dissertation. It's all very practical. They teach you very practical skills. So interpreting master's courses are very special from that point of view. There's a very, very good course in Galway, the National University of Ireland in Galway. I would urge you to check it out if you're interested in interpreting. We provide a lot of support to them. We have a very close relationship with them. A few weeks ago, I was in Galway teaching, so they send interpreters from the Commission to help out. The course is very well run, very well structured. It's an excellent course, so I highly recommend it. If you want to stay in Ireland and study interpreting, that's a very, very good course. It's not just for Irish, it's for other languages as well. They've an excellent setup. And the language profile we're looking for is English A, obviously, if you're working for the English unit. And we need to either have French or German C plus one other EU language. So let me just try and break that down for you. If you come, for example, with French and Spanish, that's good. If you come with French and German, that's excellent, really, really good. We're definitely looking for French and German. If you come with German and Italian, that's also good. But let's say you come with Italian and Spanish, well, then you would need to go and work on either French or German. The reason being that those are the 2 languages we are going to interpret the most. So you have to have one of those languages coming in. If you come with Latvian, Lithuanian, Estonian, unfortunately, that's not good enough. You'll have to have one of those languages, French or German as well. So that's really something that's very, very important for us. That's a kind of a necessity for us. So it's French or German, C language plus one other EU language. And of course, Irish as well. If you come with French and Irish, that's great. If you come with German and Irish, that's great as well. We are very much looking for interpreters with Irish as well. But let me just stress, we're also looking for interpreters who don't have Irish. So we are looking for English A's at the moment. There's a reason we're holding these outreach events. There's a reason I'm talking to you. It's because we want people and we need people. So there are opportunities there for interpreters if you're interested in interpreting. So again, as stated, the derogation for Irish has expired, so we do need to provide Irish as well. Just to give you a quick run through, as I said, we support the university in Galway. We provide student bursaries. We receive study visits where we used to before the pandemic. We're hoping to start those up again when the situation allows. We provide online resources for training. Here is a list of universities that we work with as of 2019. So there are a lot of universities across Europe and beyond, in fact, that we work with. We work sometimes with African universities, universities in Turkey, for example. Just if you're going to do one of these courses, make sure that it caters to your language combination. So if you're an English A, make sure it caters to English A's. There are some in continental Europe that do that, or even not continental Europe. There's one on the Canary Islands in Spain, which is a very good course, very nice location, but it's a very, very good course as well. So they will also train English A's as well as Spanish A's. We can provide financial support. We provide grants for universities. So we provided support for the university in Galway. So again, they now have just recently re-equipped with modern equipment, interpreting equipment at the university in Galway. Student bursaries, again, this is far from a guarantee, but they are available. So again, you can apply for a bursary if your profile is interesting. You can receive up to €2,400 if you study in an EU member state. Outside of the EU, 1,600. When I did my interpreting course, it was in Romania in 2006 before they joined the EU. So I did actually get a bursary, but I got a smaller bursary, and I think it was less at the time. And there's a link there for information on bursaries. So everything you need to know about that. That is only available for EU nationals, I'm afraid. And in the 2018-2019 academic year, there were 14 bursaries granted to English A's, including students studying in Galway. And there are also bursaries available for Irish A's. So once you have your qualification, what do you do then? So the first step is to sit the interinstitutional accreditation test. And this is where freelancers come in, which I spoke about earlier. If you pass this test, so it's an interpreting test. Once you've graduated, you can apply for this interpreting test. You go and you just interpret. You have interpreting tests. You have several speeches that you have to interpret. And if you pass that test, you can become an auxiliary conference interpreter, ACI, or a freelance interpreter, and then you're put on a common list and you can work for all of the institutions. So you can work for the Commission, you can work for the European Parliament and the European Court of Justice, all three. So when I started off as a freelance interpreter. I would say 95% of interpreters working at the Commission started off this way. But a lot of people want to stay freelancers. Some people don't want to work on staff. They like the flexibility. They have other clients as well. Sometimes they translate as well. And they can go off and do other things. And some people are perfectly happy. During the pandemic, it must be said that there was a lull in work for freelance interpreters, but it seems to have picked back up again. Most of the freelance interpreters I talk to are happy with the amount of work they get. And you can be any nationality. So we have interpreters working in the English unit from India, Trinidad, US, Canada, various different English-speaking countries. You don't have to be an EU citizen for that. The pay, you're paid by the day. It's a net rate of €330 when you start off, going up to €420 when you have more experience. And then on top of that, you have all the pension contributions, insurance, etc. And again, as I said, there are plenty of people who are perfectly happy being freelance interpreters and earn their living perfectly well being freelance interpreters. And when you start off, if you're a newcomer, the Commission will provide significant support to you and also provide some support for learning languages, etc. For staff positions, there's temporary agents. So if you're a freelance interpreter, you can be offered a position as a temporary agent. That happened to me. If your language combination is interesting, you have a certain amount of experience, you can be offered a position as a temporary agent. So that means you work on commission staff for a certain period of time. It's 3 years usually, and it can be extended for another 3 years. So I was a temporary agent for quite a while. Then there are two paths to becoming a permanent member of staff. There's the open competitions, which Caoimhe spoke extensively about. I must say I think it was 2 and failed 2 open competitions. They're a grueling process, it must be said. And it's not easy, but I would advise you to persevere. I would definitely advise you to persevere. And in fact, it was just nerves. I failed on the interpreting, even though the next day I was in working as an interpreter. It's a lot of pressure, at least from the interpreting test point of view. There's another path, which are internal competitions, which is what I did and finally passed. So that's only open to people who are on temporary contracts. But there've been a number of internal competitions, and so I passed an internal competition, which is exactly the same as an open competition in terms of the interpreting test, but just without some of the other stuff besides. So you don't have some of the tests at the beginning, for example, these computer-based tests, etc. You do have interview, you do have the interpreting test. But to be on staff, you need to be an EU national. So you need to be a citizen of an EU member state to be on staff. So that's it. Sorry, I've spoken at great length. There are 2 videos here. And the first video is interpreting as a career. So that is a variety of colleagues. You would probably see my face in there very briefly as well, talking about how they became interpreters. Again, these are English language interpreters. So there's a general video, which is I think about 6 or 7 minutes long. And then there's a whole series of other videos, longer videos, which each colleague talks at greater length about their path into interpreting. And then there's another much more general video. I'd advise you to start with that. It's a brief introduction by our Director General, and she's speaking in Spanish. It's a very multilingual video. Click on the English subtitles, and then it just there's the a description of how relay works. So again, a demonstration of how a meeting actually works and the mechanics of interpreting in a meeting, which I think is quite interesting. And again, you might briefly see my face in that video as well. So sorry for going at such great length. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
No, not at all, Kevin. Actually, that's fantastic. I mean, really great insights. And I've been around this block a while, and I always learn something new. So I think you really brought to life what it means to be an interpreter, as well as those very practical pieces around how you get there. There's a couple of questions already coming in on Slido, but I'm gonna sort of abuse my position a little bit and kick off with one, just very general question to both yourself and also maybe to Caoimhe as well. The question really is, in terms of the greatest challenge of the career, I mean, what's the hardest bit about it? To start with something negative, and then to finish this set of 2 questions, what is the most rewarding piece? If you could give us an insight into both of those aspects, I think that would be helpful. Thanks. Maybe Kevin, start with you.
Okay. Yeah, so the most difficult part, it is, I mean, interpreting is stressful in a way. So you're on the spot. It's very challenging in that regard. So you can have fairly long days. You're sitting in the booth. It can be quite challenging. You're under a lot of pressure. It's a very sort of acute pressure. And yeah, that kind of builds up over time, so it can be quite tiring. So when you go on summer holidays and just let it go, you feel the relief, okay, but at the same time, that is also really rewarding. You feel the adrenaline when you're interpreting. You feel the adrenaline when you're in a situation, for example, having interpreted someone like Michel Barnier, which is quite a challenge. It's a little bit terrifying at the moment. I'm going to interpret it, especially during the Brexit negotiations, when everyone is trying to read the tea leaves of what Michel Barnier is saying. You think, I really hope I get all of this right, and I really hope I get all of the nuances. So you've got the pressure there, but at the same time, it is quite rewarding afterwards. Oh, I interpreted Michel Barnier. Oh, I saw in the newspaper that somebody was, quoting using my words. Sometimes that's a little bit terrifying as well. I hope I used the right expression there. Or the one time that, my parents sent me a video saying I was on the 6-1 News, the press conference, and they just plugged into the feed from the interpreting booths, and my voice came out on RT 6-1 News. So that's quite nice as well, so it can be quite. So you've got the acute pressure, but you also have the reward of it as well. You've got the adrenaline rush in a way, which is quite nice.
Caoimhe?
I would say that for translators, it's quite different. We don't have the same sense of immediate pressure as the interpreters, obviously. But I think especially for new translators, the biggest challenge is reaching that level of confidence in your language skills, in your comprehension skills. A lot of the documents we translate are really complex, and they're going to be used to decide whether or not to, impose penalties on a member state, which could take the form of, €1 billion that will be taken away, of a grant that they'll have to pay back, or, so these are documents that we're working on are really you know, really relevant, and they're going to be used to make decisions at an EU level. So there's this pressure to, you know, there cannot be any errors in our documents, really, you know. So and while, as Kevin said, we have time to look up the words and, you know, check with other people and everything, and all our work is revised, that is still a pressure that, you know, you really don't want somebody to come back and say there was a huge error and it caused us all this trouble, you know. But the very rewarding part, I would say, is that you're learning every single day. Every day you learn a new word, a new expression, something new about one of the countries. Romanian, for example, is a very new language for me, and unlike Kevin, I didn't live there for years. You know, I was there for 2 weeks of my whole life, and every document I translate shows me something new about the people and the culture, and that is very rewarding. So, you know, I think all jobs that have a lot of challenges are also extremely rewarding. So I can definitely say that's the case for translation, and clearly for interpreting as well.
Okay, getting quite a few questions, quite specific ones really, on the Slido channel, and then also in terms of the chat with this too. There are different questions. So let's get stuck into a few of those. Some of these, I think the answers are clear enough, and I'd ask maybe both of you just to jump in as you feel it's more relevant to if you feel it's more relevant to yourself. Are there possibilities of remote work in the fields of translation and interpretation?
Just for if you want to work not as a freelance, so if you want to be a member of staff, you do have to be in the office a certain amount. We can work remotely, but we still have to be based in the country where we're employed. With coronavirus, there have been, you know, more flexible working arrangements, but essentially if you're working for DGT based in Luxembourg, you do have to move to Luxembourg. For them, it might change in the future, but for now, that's not the case.
Kevin?
Yeah, for interpreting, it's much more complex. There were some attempts during the pandemic to do some more remote interpreting, but what we did was we had to come into work and sit in the booth, and it was the participants were remote and was fed in through us. And it's very difficult. There's some progress being made in that, and some interpreters are doing that. Even for the Parliament, I think there's been the occasional meeting where interpreters are nowhere near the meeting and they're at home working from home, but it's very rare. It's a fairly new, again, like Caoimhe said, it might change in the future, but you have to be in Brussels. Or as a freelancer, you can be based elsewhere. And you can come and work, but most of the work is in Brussels.
Okay, another question that I think you've probably both touched on. What are the languages with the highest demand for translation and interpretation services in the EU, and the lowest?
That's a really easy one to answer, actually. To do the competition, you just need to pass the competition. What languages you have will not be taken into consideration. So it doesn't matter if you have the most boring combination of languages. I had French and Spanish. It's not unusual at all. You just need to pass the competition. So don't worry too much about what your languages are. The languages that we have at the Commission, the most need for are going to be languages like Polish, Romanian, Lithuanian, Latvian, Estonian, but very few people will, some people will have them for one reason or another. Most people who apply will have a combination of French and Spanish, French and German, French and Italian. And that's no problem at all. The important thing is to pass the test. And after that, if you have those other more unusual languages, that's brilliant. Maybe it's slightly different for interpreting.
Not usually different, in fact, but what we're looking for, if you come with French and Spanish, that's great. If you can come and you can add something like, let's say you happen to have Lithuanian, that's brilliant as well. Together with one of the bigger languages, with French or German. Just in terms of the actual amount of work, there's a slight discrepancy between the amount that you'll actually interpret something. I very rarely interpret people from Romanian, unfortunately, or Dutch. And most of the interpreting I do is from French and Spanish. But it's actually, these languages need to be covered as well. So again, in a meeting, I'd occasionally interpret French, I'd occasionally interpret Romanian or Dutch. I spend most of the time interpreting French and Spanish, but the languages need to be covered. So again, it's attractive if you can offer those languages. But if you come with what we would say just the normal languages, I know there's this whole thing of exotic languages. If you're Estonian isn't exotic to you, I know, but if it's a bit exotic for us, that's great. But also if you just come with the normal ones that most people would know: French and Spanish, French and German, German and Spanish. That's fine. We need that. We really need that. So don't hesitate if you feel that you just have those languages. No, that's great. We need people with those languages. What's important is how well you can interpret, the skills you have, the level you have of the language, and your interpreting skills. That's very important.
Okay, thanks, Kevin, and thanks, Caoimhe, on that one. Can a non-EU citizen become a translator or interpreter in the EU? I think, Kevin, you've already averted that, but maybe you could recap for us.
Yes, so I just saw the chat there. Yes, in the EU, it is, if you want to be a staff interpreter, it would be, I think, very, very difficult. You would have to be an EU citizen. And again, I saw somebody said temporary staff. You can't even become temporary staff because temporary staff is staff. You have to be an EU citizen to have a staff position. But as a freelance interpreter, you do not need to be an EU citizen at all. You do not need to be an EU citizen. You can be any nationality to be a freelance interpreter. And it's again, there are plenty of people who earn a very, very good living interpreting as freelance interpreters. You don't have to be you don't have to be on staff to earn a decent living here. But just to say that the EU isn't the only game in town when it comes to interpreting. There's the United Nations, there's NATO, there are various other international institutions, and there are people who work as freelance interpreters, and again, who earn quite a decent living. So you don't necessarily have to work for the EU if you're interested in interpreting.
Caoimhe, have you anything on that issue of non-EU citizens?
You have to be an EU citizen to work. Yeah. So.
Another one then, maybe just in the translation space, Caoimhe, if you do not have a translation qualification but have experience of translation in another country, is there still a route in?
You don't need to have a translation qualification at all. You can have a qualification in anything. You just need to be able to pass the translation test. That's how we decide if you have the level and if you have the skills. You will have to do a translation and a revision from both of the languages you are applying with, and you will have to do a main languages skills test. So if you're applying for a job as an English translator, there's quite a difficult English language test to make sure that you have native level English. But you do not need to have a qualification. You also, I saw somebody asked in the chat, what level do you need? I believe they will say it in the notice of competition. I believe they ask for level B2, but it could be C1. But you don't need anything to prove that. You need to basically tick the boxes that you can understand, that you can communicate. But you don't need a certificate from l'Alliance Française or a university to say that you have French, for example. You have to be able to pass the test.
Yeah. Do you need 3 languages if you're translating into Irish, or is there any exception due to the shortage of Irish language professionals in the institutions?
Eamonn, maybe you could jump in there. I think it's still 3 languages.
Yes, so for the permanent jobs, you'd still need the 3 languages. But there are contracts, and if you look at the different institutions, and both Caoimhe and Kevin would have gone through the different institutions, you can see that there are contracts you can get, short-term contracts where you can work with 2 languages and then beef up, let's say, your French or whatever language you did for Leaving Cert, and make sure that you're ready for a proper competition.
And I believe it is possible that might change, because I know now that for a lot of the language departments that only translate from English, now they are in the notices of competition, they are just saying, if it's for a German role, German and English. That might become the case for Irish if it's too hard to find people, but we can't know that in advance. So
the important thing is that there are ways in. So it's just a question of doing the research and contacting us. You'll get our contact details so that you can ask us about the different ways in.
And actually, maybe just one last one then before maybe we bring things to a close. Again, in the Irish language space in particular, and I don't know, Eamonn, you may have a fresh view on this, or either of our other 2 contributors. But are there plans to hire more Irish translators in 2022 based in Grange?
There's a very simple answer to that. I'm afraid not. That was a particular competition. There are a number of spaces there, and obviously they're filled at the moment. This was an experiment that was done when I think Swedish and Finnish became EU languages as well. And it'll be a question, I mean, obviously they moved those units to Brussels and to Luxembourg. So it's a question of how this works. So far, so good. But we do have the people in situ at the moment in Grange.
Okay, thank you very much. I think, you know, we've covered a lot of ground in the questions, and I'm sure, you know, the pathways that we've outlined in terms of how to contact the Commission or the Department of Foreign Affairs will afford an opportunity if people do have questions after this evening that they'd like to pursue. So maybe just to bring us to a close, I want to first of all just offer sincere thanks to Caoimhe Alliot and to Kevin McCarthy for outlining the career paths available and for taking the time to share your experience with us. Kevin and Caoimhe, very much appreciated. Thanks to our colleagues in the European Commission representation in Ireland. Thanks to you, Eamonn, in particular, for your continued efforts and collaboration in this area. The representation's own website here in Brussels, where I'm speaking to you from, has a range of information about career opportunities. The Department of Foreign Affairs also provides support, as I mentioned. So that's another way of finding out about this. You can get in contact with us at eujobs@dfa.ie if you're thinking of applying. You can also follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook at EU Jobs Ireland to keep you up to date with any upcoming events and opportunities. So please do pursue these channels of inquiry if you're interested in a career in what I think are very, very interesting spaces to work in. So I hope the webinar, just in conclusion, has offered you encouragement to all of those who've joined us online. I hope it's given you a certain energy and a certain spark of interest. And thank you for taking the opportunity to be with us today, and have a very good evening and good luck with your careers ahead. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.